Hi, this is Jerry at Canna Intel 420. A lot of people ask about original lines like there is supposed to be one clean answer hiding somewhere behind enough digging. One vault, one archive, one guy with a freezer full of untouched history, and if you ask the right person, the whole thing opens up. That is usually where the fantasy starts outrunning the subject. Before getting into any of that, this content is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, legal advice, or cultivation advice for any jurisdiction where cultivation is prohibited. Nothing here is meant to promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where it is not legal. Always follow your local, state, and tribal laws, and consume responsibly where legal to do so. Now with that out of the way, here we go. When people ask where the original lines went, the honest answer is that there is no single universally trusted vault holding all of them. The material now sits across two different lanes. One is institutional, where plant genetic resources are archived as documented germplasm for conservation, evaluation, and research. The other is private, where collectors, breeders, and seed sellers maintain historically sourced or regionally associated material under their own collection, regeneration, and record-keeping practices. The two lanes can overlap in purpose, but they do not run on the same evidentiary standard, access rules, or documentation culture. The institutional lane is built around accessions. In plant genetic resource work, an accession is a distinct, uniquely identifiable sample representing a cultivar, breeding line, or population that is maintained in a genobank for conservation and use. That is a different thing from a retail promise, a strain story, or a claim about untouched purity. It is a documented sample held within a conservation system. The emphasis is on identity, storage, regeneration, and use under controlled record keeping rather than on selling a consumer-facing idea of authenticity. On the U.S. side, the USDA-ARS Hemp Germplasm Repository in Geneva, New York, reported 581 accessions in January 2024. Cornell's repository fact sheet states that the materials are collected from around the world and entered into GRIN Global with detailed passport information. It states that seeds are dried and cold stored, then regenerated indoors for 4 to 5 months with the stated intent of preserving allelic diversity. The same fact sheet says the material is evaluated for multiple traits, screened for regulatory compliance below 0.3% THC, and made available through the GRIN Global system for research use. At the broader system level, GRIN states that the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System curates more than 600,000 active accessions across food and agricultural plants. Its taxonomy page for cannabis sativa currently lists 813 accessions in the National Plant Germplasm System, with 656 active and 61 available. GRIN also states that NPGS germplasm is not available for individual home gardening and is distributed primarily to professional plant breeders, career research scientists, and certain other qualified requesters. Cannabis-specific infrastructure is also beginning to take clearer shape beyond the Geneva repository itself. The International Cannabis Genetic Resources Collection maintains a virtual gene bank page whose stated purpose is to catalog available cannabis genetic resource collections worldwide, with the goal of using authoritative accessions for cultivars used in studies. That matters because it reflects an effort to map public and semi-public resource holdings in a way that ties research to documented material rather than loose commercial naming. Even so, the institutional lane does not answer the consumer question in the way many people imagine. A GenBank accession is a conserved sample, not a magical time capsule. It may represent a landrace, a breeding line, or an improved cultivar, and its job is to preserve a documented genetic resource as close as possible to the original submitted sample. The system is built for conservation and use. It is not built to certify that every historically interesting sample has remained isolated from all later gene flow forever. What the public lane gives is curation, storage, regeneration protocols, identity records, and access rules. It does not cancel the biological realities of the crop. The private lane is what most people are actually talking about when they ask where to find original material. That lane is populated by preservation-oriented seed companies, collectors, and regional projects. Ace Seeds says it is dedicated to preservation and study, describes its catalog as built from pure varieties collected from around the world and preserved in its collection, and markets its seeds as genetic preservation souvenirs for adults. The Real Seed Company describes itself as a specialist site for authentic traditional cannabis varieties established in 2007, says it is run by plant hunters and seed collectors, and states that its long-term goal is public good preservation of the seeds it collects. Indian Landrace Exchange describes itself as a collective of indigenous frontline farmers, seed collectors, and preservationists from Central and Southeast Asia that collects, documents, preserves, selects, and seeks to improve landrace and heirloom genetics. Those descriptions are useful, but they are still self-descriptions of mission, sourcing model, and preservation intent. They do not amount to third-party confirmation that a line has zero introgression, perfect geographic continuity, or uninterrupted isolation across generations. More importantly, preservation intent and preservation outcome are not the same thing. A seller can be operating in good faith and still be offering material that has passed through regeneration, selection, bottlenecking, contamination risk, incomplete locality records, or simple documentation gaps that materially affect what the buyer is actually receiving. That does not make the private lane worthless. It means the claim starts the inquiry rather than ending it. That caution becomes more important in cannabis because the crop itself does not cooperate with fantasies of absolute purity. Frontier's 2022 perspective on cross-pollination states that cannabis is exclusively wind-pollinated, that male plants produce very large amounts of pollen, and that pollination risk is significant enough that multiple studies have tried to establish buffer zones. The same article stresses a point that gets missed constantly in casual conversation. The exchange of genetic material shows up in the next generation from seed, not as some mystical contamination story that instantly rewrites the already standing mother plant. Add that to the well-established fact that cannabis is highly heterozygous and predominantly outcrossing, and the practical conclusion is straightforward. Claims of zero introgression or untouched continuity need more than a good backstory. The private preservation question, then, is not simply who has the most dramatic catalog language. It is who can account for the chain. Collection locality matters. Collection date matters. Whether the seed lot was field collected, regenerated in isolation, reproduced from a broad enough parental base, narrowed through selection, or later converted into inbred or hybrid work, all matters. If a seller is open about what was collected, where it came from, how it was maintained, and what was done to it afterward, that is useful. If the description jumps from regional story to implied purity without that middle layer of handling history, the gap is real. That is not cynicism. It is source discipline grounded in how accessions, breeding pools, and outcrossing crops actually work. The institutional and private lanes also should not be played against each other as if one cancels the other out. Public repositories preserve documented samples under formal curation and give research a more stable reference structure. Private preservation groups often reach places, communities, and materials that institutional systems either do not yet hold, cannot easily access, or have not fully characterized. The trouble starts when the authority associated with one lane gets blended with the storytelling habits of the other and then presented as if the result were settled fact. So where did the original lines go? Some entered formal germplasm systems as accessions, where they are conserved, documented, and in some cases made available to qualified researchers. Some persisted in regional cultivation and in private hands, where preservation depends on collector practice, regeneration discipline, record keeping, and honesty about what has and has not been changed. Some almost certainly disappeared. Some survive only as derivatives, narrowed reproductions, or materials carrying ancestry rather than pristine continuity. That is the picture. Not one vault, not one marketplace. Material split across public and private systems with uneven documentation and a constant need to separate preserved material from preserved mythology. If there is one thing to leave this with, it is that old material does not stay meaningful by rumor alone. It stays meaningful through records, handling, regeneration, storage, and whether anybody can still account for what happened to it after collection. That is the difference between chasing a story and actually tracing a line. So when people start throwing around words like preserved, original, rare, or untouched, slow it down and look at what is actually behind the claim. Look at who held it, how it was maintained, what changed, what was selected, what was lost, and what can still be shown. That is where this subject stops being romantic and starts being real. This remains educational and informational only. It is not legal advice, medical advice, or cultivation advice for any jurisdiction where cultivation is prohibited, and it is not meant to promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where it is illegal. Follow your local, state, and tribal laws, and consume responsibly where legal to do so. This has been Jerry at Canna Intel 420.